They say you can tell everything about a man by the way he treats someone who can't do anything for him. And on that night, under golden chandeliers and the echo of overpriced laughter, Bryce Langford revealed exactly who he was. The ballroom smelled of expensive perfume and privilege. Waiters moved like shadows, trays of oysters and champagne dancing between murmured deals and fake compliments. This wasn't just a party, it was a show of wealth, a flex. And in the middle of it, knelt a woman in a gray cleaning uniform, quietly scrubbing wine off the marble floor as if she wasn't even there. But Bryce saw her, not as a person, but as an opportunity to make a joke. He stepped closer, drink in hand, suit crisp, smile smug. "You're not like the others," he said, voice low enough to pretend he was being subtle. "You look smarter. I like that. How much for the night, off the clock?" Someone laughed. Not loud, but just enough. A senator's son, maybe, or some old money investor who still called their housekeeper girl. She didn't flinch, just looked up, slowly, calmly, and said 5 words that would be remembered far longer than any gala highlight reel. "Sir, I clean messes. Thoroughly." He chuckled, handed her a $500 bill like a magician performing a cheap trick. "Well then," he said, "start with mine." What Bryce Langford didn't know, what no one in that gilded room could imagine, was that the woman he just humiliated wasn't there to clean his mess. She was there to expose it. She wasn't just the maid. She was a strategist, a trained corporate investigator. And tonight, she had one final file to collect. Before taking down the most untouchable man in Silicon Valley. By morning, his empire would burn, and it would all begin with a mop. Her name wasn't on the guest list, but her fingerprints all over Bryce Langford's secrets. Ava Thompson had learned long ago that power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it comes disguised, in silence, in humility, in people no one bothers to look at twice. Born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, Ava didn't come from money. She came from late-night bus rides, school lunches with government stamps, and a mother who worked 2 shifts at a nursing home just to keep the lights on. But Ava? She had a mind that wouldn't sit still. By 22, she had a full scholarship to UCLA. By 28, she held a PhD in organizational behavior and was teaching ethics to MBA candidates who'd never once cleaned their own bathrooms. She was on track to become one of the youngest department heads in her university, until she made one mistake. She told the truth. She exposed a tenured dean for covering up wage theft and sexual harassment in a university-affiliated business. And in return, her contract wasn't renewed. Her name was blacklisted. Her references went silent. For a while, she fought back. Filed reports, sent letters. No one listened. So she stopped talking and started planning. She joined a grassroots watchdog group called Civic Integrity Alliance. Quietly, under the radar. They didn't need noise. They needed proof. And Ava was an expert at patterns, power dynamics, and human behavior. Her job? To go where whistleblowers were too scared to tread, to get close, to collect. That's how she ended up mopping floors at Langford's company gala. Not because she needed the money, though the bills were very real, but because Bryce Langford was more than just another rich man with a god complex. He was dangerous. Dozens of NDAs. Fired single mothers, interns who never came back after after-hours meetings, and charities that were more shell than service. He was a name too big to question, until Ava started asking, She'd been to 4 of his events, under 4 different names: janitor, caterer, shuttle driver, lobby check-in, and no one ever noticed her. That was their first mistake. Their second? Thinking she'd ever let this one go. At home, in her tiny 2-bedroom apartment just off Crenshaw Boulevard, she kept 3 binders full of records, witness statements, internal memos, screenshots of encrypted group chats. She kept a burner phone, a voice recorder, and a USB drive taped behind the toilet tank, because experience had taught her one thing: the truth only matters when you have receipts. And now, she had them all. But tonight wasn't just another assignment. It was personal, because 10 years ago, her cousin Maya, a brilliant coder, was one of Bryce's interns. And after one off-the-record trip to a Langford estate in Lake Tahoe, Maya came back different, shaken, silent, and a month later, gone. Ava never got answers, but she's about to get justice. The Langford Foundation Charity Gala was designed to be untouchable. Private security, non-disclosure agreements, no press allowed inside, guests handpicked from a list of billionaires, celebrities, senators, and people who hadn't washed their own dishes in a decade. It was Bryce Langford's playground, and tonight he was in rare form. Drunk on his own ego and vintage whiskey, he strolled across the ballroom like a man who believed the world revolved around him. Because for years, it had. Until Ava Thompson walked into his orbit. Still crouched near the spill, she was finishing the job she was paid to do: clean, disappear, and leave without a trace. That was the original plan. Quiet infiltration. Data collection, out the door. But Bryce changed that, with 5 words and a folded bill. How much for the night? The music didn't stop. The chandelier didn't flicker. But the air shifted. Several heads turned. One woman laughed into her wine. A hedge fund manager smirked. Ava looked up. Expression unreadable. And Bryce, misreading her silence as submission, pushed further. No shame, sweetheart. I admire the hustle. You clean floors with class. I'm just giving you a better floor to stand on. He winked, and that was it. The moment Ava broke protocol. The moment a woman who had spent months hiding decided to speak. She stood, slowly, calmly, her gloved hand still damp from bleach, her voice clear as crystal. "Mr. Langford," she said, "do you often proposition women on your own payroll? Or just the ones who don't wear heels?" The room stilled. Bryce blinked, thrown off by her tone. He smiled, tried to recover. "I think you're misunderstanding me." But Ava didn't stop. "No, I think you're very clear. You think your money entitles you to anything. A name, a body, silence." She pulled off her gloves, letting them fall to the floor like dropped armor. "But you see, I'm not here for silence." Someone near the bar pulled out a phone. Another leaned in to whisper. Bryce's smirk cracked just slightly. "This is not the place," he muttered, suddenly aware that the room had shifted, that he was no longer the center of attention, but the eye of the storm. "Funny," Ava said, "because this is exactly the place. The marble floors, the overpriced wine, the masks you all wear and call it charity." She turned to the crowd. "How many of you know what happens behind those philanthropy meetings? How many interns you've hired, then buried under silence and checks?" No one spoke, but eyes darted. Phones buzzed. The word "live" popped up on someone's screen. Then Ava did something that would change everything. She reached into her cart, not for a mop, but for a small, sleek tablet. She tapped the screen, and the ballroom lights dimmed. The projector meant for Langford's keynote lit up behind her, but not with his presentation. Instead, the screen flickered to a hidden recording, taken just 1 week earlier. A private meeting at Langford's estate. Him, 2 board members, talking about firing a pregnant employee to avoid maternity delays. Laughing about it. The room gasped. Then came slide 2. Internal emails from Bryce, mocking lower-income applicants, saying DEI hires are charity cases anyway. And then audio, crisp, unedited. They all have a price. You just gotta find their weakness. Bryce lunged toward the projector, screaming at his team to shut it down. Security moved. Guests backed away. But the damage was done. One final image hit the screen. A photo of Ava's cousin Maya. Bright smile, Stanford hoodie, captioned with, "Last seen, working for Langford Tech, 2014. No trace after that. The room didn't breathe. And Ava, she walked off the stage, not escorted, not dragged, but steady, proud, silent, because her voice had already done its job, and Bryce Langford, for the first time in his life, couldn't buy his way out of what was coming. The ballroom descended into chaos. Security scrambled. Guests whispered. The air buzzed with the unmistakable energy of a public downfall beginning to unfold. The kind that couldn't be silenced with champagne or spin doctors. But Ava Thompson, she didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She walked through the double doors, past the valet, into the cool, quiet California night. This was never about making a scene. The gala was just the final thread in a web she'd been weaving for 9 months. And tonight, it finally snapped. While Bryce Langford and his empire reeled under the public exposure, Ava headed straight to where her real war room lived, a second-floor apartment above a Mexican bakery in East Hollywood. The space smelled like cinnamon rolls and sawdust, and to Ava, it smelled like control. She kicked off her shoes, sat at the dining table she used as a desk, and opened a weathered laptop covered in post-it notes and stickers. Whistle while you work. Receipts don't lie. Don't flinch. Document. On her screen was a live map of synced cloud backups, multiple encrypted folders labeled by code names, Project Glass Tower, Maya Logs, Gala Sweep. For 9 months, Ava had gathered more than just recordings. She had employee testimonials, over 2 dozen, internal HR documents showing a pattern of wrongful terminations, mostly women and minorities, emails between Bryce and a lobbying firm discussing how to quiet down that intern situation, a bank trail showing nonprofit funds being rerouted through shell companies tied to Bryce's inner circle, and most importantly, she had backup plans for every backup. Because she knew what came next. Bryce Langford wasn't the type to retreat. He was the type to retaliate, to discredit, destroy, dig up whatever dirt he could. Ava knew that. She'd seen it before, the lawsuits, the smear campaigns. The way men like him bought silence and spun shame into their favor. But this time, he wouldn't be ready for what was coming. Because this time, Ava wasn't alone. At 1:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. A coded message appeared on Signal. "The hammer's in motion. Call in the press." It was from Jordan Cruz, the investigative journalist she'd looped in months ago. He'd been following her lead, cross-referencing her files, building a legal team with her nonprofit Civic Integrity Alliance. And now, the trap was set. In less than 48 hours, the New York Times, NPR, and CBS would all publish pieces. A Senate subcommittee would open a federal inquiry. And a class action lawsuit, already prepared by 6X employees, would drop like a guillotine. But Ava didn't celebrate. Instead, she opened a folder labeled Maya. Inside were photos, emails, and text logs. Her cousin's digital footprint stopped abruptly in 2014, one day after boarding a Langford Foundation retreat in Lake Tahoe. Ava had never gotten full answers, but tonight had put the spotlight back where it belonged. With the world watching, the silence might finally break. She stared at Maya's last message. "I don't think I can stay here much longer. Something feels off." Ava closed the folder, her jaw tight. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation of names, of truth, of futures stolen. And the final act? That would play out in court. At 2:42 a.m., she clicked send on a scheduled email blast, one going out to over 40 journalists, legal contacts, and social justice orgs across the country. Subject line, "You called her a maid. Here's her resume." Attached were credentials, timelines, videos, and a statement. "My name is Dr. Ava Thompson. I hold a doctorate in organizational behavior. I've been called many things, but you will never again mistake silence for submission." Outside, Beverly Hills continued its quiet slumber, blissfully unaware that by sunrise, one of its brightest stars would start to dim. Not from scandal, but from the unbearable weight of truth finally revealed. Sunrise came quietly. But by 9:04 a.m., Beverly Hills was wide awake and burning. The first article hit the homepage of the New York Times. Langford Empire under fire, whistleblower reveals pattern of abuse, discrimination, and financial fraud. Then came CNN, then NPR. Then a trending hashtag, number Langford Files. Within hours, Ava Thompson's name was everywhere, but not as a maid, as Dr. Ava Thompson, whistleblower, strategist, justice architect. The footage from the gala went viral within minutes. Bryce's voice, slurred, smug, offering Ava money for discreet services. The crowd's laughter, his words, "They all want something. You just gotta price them right." The video had already crossed 3 million views by lunch. Politicians weighed in. Celebrities reposted with statements like, "She's not just a cleaning lady, she's the storm they didn't see coming." But the internet was only the beginning. At 10:27 a.m., the Securities and Exchange Commission announced a formal audit into Langford Technologies for suspicious donations routed through their philanthropic arms. At 11 a.m., a Senate subcommittee launched an emergency inquiry. At 11:22, the California Attorney General's office confirmed they'd received substantial whistleblower files from an anonymous corporate investigator. By noon, Bryce Langford was trending #1. Not as a tech innovator, but as a predator. In his downtown LA penthouse, Bryce stared blankly at 3 phones lighting up with red notifications. His legal counsel, Richard Vance, was already in the elevator. "She planned this," Bryce mumbled. "That woman, she set me up." Richard burst through the door. "It's worse than you think," he said flatly. "We've got subpoenas coming from 4 directions. Your board wants an emergency meeting. Investors are panicking. Tell them it was fake. Tell them I was drunk. They have timestamps, logs, witnesses, emails, bank records, and Bryce..." Richard paused. "She's not who you thought she was." He handed him a folder. Inside was Ava's full bio, her education, her speaking engagements, her consulting work with ethics boards, a photo of her at a Harvard symposium titled "Power, Perception, and Prejudice in Modern Business." Bryce sank into his leather couch. "I thought she was a janitor." "That's the problem," Richard replied. "You never look past her uniform." Meanwhile, Ava wasn't on social media. She was at a small cafe in Inglewood, sipping black coffee with her sleeves rolled up and her phone on silent. Across from her sat Jordan Cruz, the journalist who had believed her when no one else did. "You know this isn't over, right?" he asked. "They'll fight back. Hard." "Let them," Ava said. "This isn't about revenge. It's about precedent." She slid over a flash drive. "There's one more thing." Inside was the bombshell. A spreadsheet Ava had unearthed in her final sweep. Over 100 NDA settlements tied to Langford Technologies. Dates, payouts, victims. One entry stood out. Maya T., $1.2 million. Closed, January 2015. Jordan's eyes widened. "Your cousin?" Ava nodded. "She never told anyone. Not even me. But they buried her under silence. I intend to unbury every last word." Back at Langford HQ, the board of directors had seen enough. At 2:03 p.m., they released a public statement. Effective immediately, Bryce Langford has been placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. The Langford Foundation is also under review and will cease operations temporarily. Investors fled. Langford stock plummeted 38% by closing bell. By 3:45 p.m., Ava's story was the lead segment on every major evening news show. Anchors introduced her with words like hero, brilliant, and fearless. But Ava didn't celebrate. She stared out the window of the cafe, watching kids ride bikes down the sidewalk. "Justice," she whispered, "isn't loud. It's steady. It's patient. And when it arrives, it doesn't knock. It breaks the door down." That night, Bryce Langford sat alone in a luxury apartment that suddenly felt very small. The city that once opened its arms to him now crossed the street when they saw his name. And Ava? She opened her laptop. One final message ready to send. Subject: to every woman who's ever been overlooked. They called me invisible, disposable, replaceable. But you don't need permission to matter, and if they underestimate you, good. That's your greatest advantage. Signed, the Maid who brought down an empire. It started with a whisper. A name that had once been invisible in the corridors of power now echoed across city halls, boardrooms, and college lecture halls. Ava Thompson. The woman they called just the Maid had become a household name. Los Angeles couldn't look away. Not from the scandal, not from the fall, and definitely not from the quiet storm that had leveled a billion-dollar empire. Without raising her voice, the headlines kept evolving, not just Langford exposed or tech mogul ousted. Now it was, meet the whistleblower behind the movement. Dr. Ava Thompson, the mind that brought accountability to Silicon Valley. Not a janitor. A Justice Architect colleges invited her to speak. Nonprofits flooded her inbox asking for workshops, mentorships, collaborations. A local news anchor called her the Rosa Parks of corporate truth. But Ava, she didn't buy into the praise. Fame was never the goal. Impact was. So while tabloids speculated about book deals and TV offers, Ava was somewhere no camera could follow. In a free legal clinic downtown, helping a single mother file a workplace harassment complaint, this time with actual backing. She declined interviews from every major network, except one. 3 weeks after the scandal, she sat across from 60 Minutes journalist Dana Ellis. No makeup team, no stylist, just her, a blazer, and a voice that didn't waver. "Why did you do it?" Dana asked. Ava paused, then answered, "Because the system counts on people like me staying silent. because somewhere there's another young woman scrubbing floors who thinks she has no power. I needed her to see. That's a lie. The segment aired nationwide. Ratings soared, and with it came change. The Langford Accountability Act was drafted in the California State Senate. Legislation designed to protect employees from NDA-based silencing and retaliation. It passed in a bipartisan vote within 60 days. Across tech firms and investment houses, HR departments began reviewing their complaint protocols. Quietly, carefully, nervously. Because now, they knew someone was watching. At Civic Integrity Alliance, the watchdog group that had helped Ava behind the scenes, donations tripled. Whistleblower tips skyrocketed. Justice was no longer a concept. It had a name, a face, and a blueprint. Meanwhile, Bryce Langford, he sold his mansion in the hills to cover legal fees, moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Glendale. Word was he was trying to consult for a small startup, but no one wanted his name on a press release. Once, he'd stood at the top of the mountain. Now, he was the cautionary tale at the bottom. But perhaps the most poetic moment came quietly when Jennifer Lee, the woman who once managed Ava's cleaning schedule, walked into Ava's new nonprofit office. She carried a letter and trembling hands. "I knew something was wrong that night," Jennifer said, "but I didn't protect you. I'm sorry." Ava stood, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Doing the right thing when it's easy means nothing. Doing it when it's hard, that's what changes the world." Then she hugged her, not out of forgiveness, but out of recognition of how much courage it takes to come back and face your silence. And the city, it learned that day what power really looks like. Not a boardroom, not a bank account, but a woman with calloused hands, a doctorate on the wall, and the audacity to say, "No, not this time." It was a quiet Wednesday morning when Ava Thompson stood on the stage of Columbia Business School, the same university that had once blacklisted her for speaking out. Now they had invited her back, not as a warning, but as a keynote speaker. The auditorium was filled with future CEOs, venture capitalists, policymakers, the next generation of power. They wore pressed suits and carried iPads, but when Ava stepped onto the stage, the room fell into a silence that had nothing to do with her title, and everything to do with her story. She wasn't flashy, no big entrance, no buzzwords, just presence, steady, grounded, and unapologetically honest. She looked at the crowd and said, "Power reveals more than it protects. And the way you treat the person you think can't harm you is the truest reflection of who you are." She paused. Let that settle. "I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to keep my head down, be grateful for the scraps, maybe work my way up just enough to stay out of trouble. But life taught me early. Silence doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you small." She talked about Maya, about broken systems, about invisible workers who clean the floors others walk on, while holding more dignity in their silence than most men in suits hold in their speeches. "I've been a professor and a janitor, and let me tell you something. The only real difference was who people thought mattered in the room." A few students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Good. She wanted that, because discomfort was the beginning of awareness, and awareness was the beginning of change. She ended her speech with a single lesson, the one that had built her entire life. Never mistake someone's role for their worth. The receptionist could be your next investor. The janitor might hold the receipts. And the woman you call just the maid might be the reason your empire doesn't survive the season." The room erupted in applause, but Ava didn't smile for the crowd. She smiled because somewhere in the back row, she saw a young black woman in a hoodie and sneakers, sitting alone, listening like her life depended on it. That was her legacy, not the headlines, not the lawsuit, not the fall of a tech giant, but the spark, the moment someone realizes, "I'm not invisible, and I'm not alone." Later that evening, Ava walked past the Langford Tower, once a monument to arrogance, now renamed the Maya Center for Workplace Equity after a public campaign led by civic groups nationwide. She didn't stop, didn't pose for photos, just kept walking, coat in hand, the city lights dancing in her reflection. She had work to do, because the world didn't need another hero. It needed more eyes open, more voices steady, more people brave enough to notice the ones no one sees, and brave enough to become one of them, just long enough to change everything. Because in the end, the greatest revenge was never destruction. It was dignity, and the kind of legacy they'd never be able to bury, no matter how much they paid for silence. What would you do if someone underestimated your entire worth based on your job or your clothes? Have you ever witnessed quiet strength flip a situation like Ava did? Drop your thoughts below and share this if you believe dignity can be louder than money.